Today, we are unpacking some source material that, quite frankly, might completely shift how you understand yourself, your stress, and your relationships. Our title today is The Architecture of Hypervigilance: Survival Through Emotional Observation. Okay, let's jump right in. We're going on a really fascinating journey to explore exactly how the emotional environments of our childhoods don't just affect our memories, but they literally, physically shape the wiring of our nervous systems. So, why do some people never stop reading the room? Like, if you're someone who walks into a space and instantly senses the mood, you pick up on the hidden tension, you know exactly who's unhappy or agitated before anyone even says a word, well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's this profound, incredibly common experience, but man, it is deeply exhausting. You're constantly scanning, constantly analyzing. But why do we do it? And where does it actually come from?
All right, Section 1, Reading the Room. Listening for the shift.
This brings us to a pretty harsh reality for a lot of children. Safety is not stable. And the real tragedy here isn't necessarily that someone explicitly sits a kid down and says, hey, the world is a super dangerous place. It's more that the emotional atmosphere just keeps changing without any warning. A room that felt perfectly calm an hour ago can suddenly become incredibly tense. A caregiver who is totally emotionally available is suddenly withdrawn or irritable or explosive. For a child in a volatile home, a calm room doesn't actually mean safety. It's really just the pause before the storm. The nervous system learns pretty quickly that safety is basically an illusion.
So what does a child do to survive that? Well, they develop this almost superhuman, radar-like sensitivity to subtle cues. We're talking about tracking a slammed cabinet, a heavy sigh, a tiny microexpression, a slight shift in tone, even the literal texture of silence or the rhythm of heavy footsteps down the hall. Detecting a change in a vocal cadence or the tension right before an outburst becomes their sort of spidey sense. Except, instead of fighting crime, they're just trying to keep the living room peaceful. When the temperature of the home can drop in a millisecond, this extreme observation isn't a choice, it is an absolute survival necessity.
Section 2. The Emotional Surveillance System. Biology, not choice. Trauma researchers actually have a very specific term for this whole dynamic. It's called hypervigilance. The definition is the chronic activation of the nervous system's threat detection systems, even in the absence of immediate danger. This is absolutely crucial because it bridges the gap between what just feels like an emotional intuition and actual clinical neuroscience. The child literally learns, biologically, that emotional safety depends on accurately reading the room before the room turns dangerous. Just listen to this poignant realization from an individual in the research who grew up this way. I had to read her moves constantly. That single, powerful sentence right there perfectly captures the exhausting psychological environment these kids quietly inhabit for years. They are quite literally functioning as a human emotional surveillance system. Let's actually trace how this adaptation takes root over time on a timeline. So between months 0 and 12, infants are biologically wired to orient toward their caregivers, right? Connection is quite literally necessary for their survival. But as we move into years 2 through 18, if that caregiver is a source of unpredictability, the nervous system faces an impossible situation. The source of safety is now also the source of potential danger. So the brain learns to predict chaos through repetition. It prioritizes threat detection over relaxation, simply because it has to. And eventually, bleeding into decades of adulthood, this vigilance just becomes the default bodily posture. The body stays activated because, as far as it knows, the threat never really resolved. Which leads us to Section 3, Mistaken for Personality, the paradigm shift. Think about the labels we so often use to describe ourselves or that others use for us. Always anxious, high-strung, naturally worried, overly sensitive. We totally mistake these traits for a flawed personality. But the scientific reality on the right side here is entirely different. What's actually happening is chronic threat anticipation and generalizing from past environments. This brilliantly illustrates the tragedy of this whole adaptation. So many people mistake their biological conditioning for their fundamental identity. The scientific truth here is that your nervous system was intelligently shaped around chronic emotional unpredictability long before your conscious identity even fully formed. To understand how deeply ingrained this gets, we really have to look at the internal logic of a child navigating an unstable home. You see, children naturally assume responsibility for emotional environments they cannot actually regulate. Their internal steps look like this. Step 1, if I behave differently. Step 2, if I stay quiet enough. Step 3, if I become useful or careful enough. Step 4, maybe everyone will finally feel okay. They are constantly modifying their behavior, carrying this absolute crushing weight of trying to stabilize an inherently unstable environment. And you guessed it, this expectation follows us straight into adulthood. Trauma specialist Peter A. Levine notes that hypervigilance gradually produces, quote, a growing tendency to see danger where there is none. Now, we need to add a vital bit of nuance here. Your nervous system isn't just making things up arbitrarily out of nowhere. It's generalizing from past survival. The adult who panics when a partner's tone shifts just slightly, that is simply the child who learned to anticipate explosions. Section 4. The exhaustion of vigilance, the toll of constant observation. So as you can imagine, there is a profound disconnect between the outside and the inside for these folks. On the external appearance side, hypervigilant adults often look incredibly put together. They are dependable, thoughtful, conscientious, and highly functional. But looking at the internal reality, it's a whole different story. It's chronic scanning, elevated stress, profound fatigue, and never, ever truly feeling off duty. Because the nervous system rarely stops scanning, they're experiencing this peculiar kind of loneliness and total exhaustion just beneath that highly functional surface. Let's pop the hood and break down the actual physiology of this. Your nervous system was simply not designed to stay in a state of chronic threat anticipation forever. Look at what happens to these bodily systems in a hypervigilant state. Stress hormones? They stay chronically elevated. Muscles? Partially contracted all the time, just ready to react. And that leads to this incredibly tragic irony. They anticipate others' needs automatically, while entirely neglecting their own internal states. I mean, think about it. When your entire attention is constantly organized around monitoring the external environment for threats, your internal emotional awareness naturally weakens. You become incredibly skilled at tracking everyone else's moods and sensing tension immediately, but you become completely disconnected from your own feelings, your own needs, and your own physical exhaustion. All right, our final section. Section 5, when safety feels unfamiliar, the disorientation of calm. Which really begs this pivotal question. So what happens when the nervous system finally encounters actual, genuine stability? You'd think it would be this huge relief, right? Like finally a break. You'd think safety would immediately feel super comforting. But that brings us to one of the absolute cruelest paradoxes of trauma adaptation. We call it the paradox of safety. For a nervous system that is hardwired for chaos, the absence of chaos feels wildly unfamiliar and wrong. Peaceful relationships, unconsciously distrusted. Silence, it feels suspicious instead of restful. Calm people might actually seem emotionally distant to you because your nervous system associates intense chaotic activation with connection, and overall stability just feels emotionally flat. The body quite literally prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar calmness because it equates that activation with importance and survival. Because of this paradox, we have to remember one crucial thing. Healing takes time. The nervous system must learn that observation does not equal safety. You cannot simply reason your way out of this with logic. Hypervigilance is embodied conditioning. It was repeated thousands and thousands of times across years of your development. The body learned this physiologically. So the nervous system itself must slowly, gradually, and patiently learn that constant monitoring is just no longer necessary for survival. I want you to truly, deeply absorb this thought from the source material. The child who monitored the room was not irrational. The child was surviving. If you take anything away from this explainer today, let it be profound self-compassion. Your nervous system adapted intelligently to instability. It did exactly what it needed to do to keep you safe. But you know what? You are no longer in that room. The difficult, beautiful work of healing begins when your body finally realizes that life was never meant to be lived entirely from the edge of anticipation. So what would it feel like to finally put down the binoculars and just rest?
Thank you for watching. If something in this resonated with you, then you're already closer than you think. If you're ready to go deeper, there's a link below to my book, The Survival Self: How Childhood Adaptation Becomes Adult Identity, and How to Finally Live Beyond It. This isn't theory, it's a framework you can actually use. Tap the link below and step into it.